How are you?
Very good. How are you?
Good, thanks. Hey guys, how are you? Hi, Steve. How are you? Good, how about you?
Nice. Yep, your Hebrew stack. You got another lexicon, that's fun. Brain I know how to do this. I sure do. No wonder I picked it out.
Notice it.
Just have on that. It does loom a little bit. Good thing I'm not right-handed. Sit down.
Good morning, everyone.
Hey.
Morning. Good to see you all. Today we move on to a more focused series of discussions about the crucifixion. We're going to spend all of our time today in Mark, except for one really quick jaunt over to Psalm 22. So if you want to have your Bibles open, at least to Mark, if not to both of those spots. In Mark, we're going to read from Mark 1, a little bit from chapter 9, a little bit from chapter 15. So kind of similar to that like flagpole approach that I talked about already in this class. We're going to kind of look at them one more time in light of the way that Mark is building towards the crucifixion. And then when we get to the crucifixion scene itself, then you might know already why we're going to then flip over to Psalm 22. Because our purpose today is to talk about Jesus' cry of dereliction. And we almost certainly won't get through it all today. We'll have to do it today and then on Tuesday, because we're going to talk about various interpretive strategies for what it is that Jesus, what he's going through, right? So it's not just what does he say, or what is he quoting, but what is he going through when he says it? Why does he say what he says? There's also the fact that, so the cry of dereliction is only in two spots. It's in Mark and Matthew. Jesus has final words in all four Gospels, but they're not the same. Luke and John record different final words than do Mark and Matthew. But it's also the case that in Mark and Matthew, the two places where we see what we call the cry of dereliction, they are very subtly different. We're not going to get in, at least today, maybe next week if we have time, we might get into some of those differences. But the differences and sort of the linguistic differences between the two are not really all that important for our particular purpose for the class. But it's important to note that even when the cry, the final words of Jesus on the cross are the same in two texts, they're mostly the same. There are slight differences. And then, of course, you get to like John, that's the only place where it says, for example, it is finished. We are going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about the it is finished in John at a later point. And with that, it's interesting because we have to compare John's it is finished with the fact that Hebrews seems to suggest that his death on the cross didn't finish everything, right? So if John says it is finished, and then in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews is like, well, it wasn't though. There's this other stuff that also was really important that happened after the crucifixion. We're going to spend at least one whole session trying to maybe make sense as best we can of the sort of theological significance of that. So that'll come at a later point. So our purpose today is just the cry of dereliction, and then even then, really just for now, Mark's version of it. And then if we have time to compare it with Matthew next week, we'll get into that. All right, so you can see here again these sort of tent poles. There are really important things I want to point out now, so that as we're just going to read these passages, so that we can sort of let the words of the passages wash over us a bit and make some observations. But these are some pretty core initial observations I think that it's important to keep in mind as we read them. So first of all, in the Mark passage, we have the baptism of Jesus. In the Mark 9 passage, we have the transfiguration of Jesus. And then in the Mark 15 passage, it's the cross. So we go from baptism, the beginning of his ministry, the transfiguration, where a few of his select disciples see him sort of in some sense of his glory, and then the very opposite of that, him dying on a cross in shame. In the very beginning, we have a sense in which Elijah is sort of being figured by John the Baptist, although it's less clear in that passage that that's what's going on. You have then at the transfiguration it becoming much more clear that that's what's going on, because Elijah is one of the figures being transfigured with Jesus, and Elijah is mentioned in the text right after that, and in conjunction with John, right? Jesus was, we'll read in a moment, Jesus' whole thing is, oh, well, Elijah has already come again. And then you have Elijah being mentioned again at the cross as well. We're not going to get in today to the deeper significance of Elijah and why Elijah, but I just think it's important to point out that he's popping up in all these passages as a central figure. We talked already last week about the fact that at the baptism the heavens were rent open, right? And that the same word is then used at the cross for the veil being rended open. So the heavens are torn open when God speaks from the heavens, and then the veil that blocks access to the presence of God is torn open at the crucifixion. You have the Spirit descending in Mark chapter 1. You have Jesus using the word for Spirit, or not Jesus, but Mark using the word for Spirit about Jesus in the crucifixion scene for Jesus breathing his last. It's the same, from the same word group, right? So the Spirit is just the pneuma. And then over here, you can see from here to here, those four letters, that's the root of the same word, right? And so the language, there's even most scholars would say that that's intentional, that there's sort of like linguistic connections being made between the passages, sort of showing the baptism is the inauguration of the ministry of Jesus, and then the cross is sort of the culmination or the crashing of all of that, and that you're supposed to look at these sort of in relationship to each other in some respect. And then, of course, we already talked about this as well, that in Mark 1, God himself speaks from the heavens and says, "You are my son, the beloved." And then in Mark 9 of the Transfiguration, it's, "This is my son, the beloved," right? So in the baptism, it's, "You are my son, with whom I am well pleased." And then in Mark 9, it's, "This is my son, do what he says." An interesting thing, again, this is also not important for our purposes today, but just something to be thinking about. There is a little bit of a debate at the baptism about whether or not anybody but Jesus could hear the voice of the Father. Because, well, there's two things with that. First, that at the Transfiguration, it's the Father's clearly speaking to all present. "This is my son, do as he says." And at the baptism, it's "You are my son." He's speaking directly to Jesus. And if John the Baptist had heard the clear voice of God himself from the heavens saying, "You are my son," to Jesus, if John the Baptist is like, "Whoa, what?" Like, he hears this, does he then, when he's in jail, send his disciples along like, "Wait, are you really the guy?" It's like, well, you heard the voice of God say that I was the guy, right? But that's not part of Jesus' response isn't, "Well, you heard God say that I was his son." Instead, Jesus' response is, "Well, you see what I'm doing, right? Like, clearly I'm the Messiah. You can see everything that I'm doing, things that the Messiah does." That's his response. So there's a little bit, there's never really any indicator, we make an assumption that, but there's no indicator in the text that anybody but Jesus at the baptism even heard God's voice. But I'm not suggesting that John didn't hear it. I'm just saying that there are scholars who would argue that he didn't. So that's kind of interesting as well. Like, God is speaking only potentially maybe to Jesus, or maybe not, at the baptism. He's very clearly speaking to all present at the Transfiguration, but it's a very small group. And then as we're going to get to, he speaks not at all at the cross verbally, but instead it's actually then, the centurion who says, "Truly this man is the Son of God." We'll talk about this when we get to the cross scene. It's a really interesting question to ask. What is it about the way that Jesus dies that allows the centurion to come to this conclusion? Right? Like, it's when John the Baptist says, "Are you the Messiah?" And again, Jesus' thing is, "Well, you see what I'm doing." But the centurion also comes to the conclusion that he definitely is the Son of God. But he's not doing all those things. He's not healing and teaching and pushing out demons. And he's like dying in shame on a cross. But there's something about the way in which he does. And by the way, what would that centurion have been more practiced at than anything else? Putting people on a cross and killing them, right? Like, that's his job. He's an executioner who crucifies people. Either that or maybe he was just a regular centurion standing nearby or whatever. But the idea is that the Romans crucified just enough people that I'm sure he's been through this before. And there's something about the way Jesus dies that's not like the way everybody else goes through that same experience. So that the centurion is like, wait a minute, maybe he really is that Son of God that they're saying he isn't. Maybe the thing they're killing him for, maybe it actually is true, and it's the way he dies that potentially leads him to that conclusion. Annie, a question? Thought?
Yeah, just on the baptism thing. My first thought was like, if no one else heard it, then that meant that Jesus had to be the one to tell the disciples. And for whatever reason, that feels like more unlikely. That he's like, oh, just by the way, when I was baptized, you'll never believe it. The heavens opened up. Like, I feel like that would be more for the sake of the crowd. Like, yeah, for the sake of
Jesus
the
already knows that.
crowds.
Yeah, especially because it becomes a part of the oral traditions about Jesus for them to be able to make it into the text, right? I mean, when you think about it, yeah, somebody still had to tell whoever, because Mark didn't get this from John the Baptist, you don't think. He got it from his relationships with Peter and potentially other followers of Jesus and that sort of thing. But yeah, there is a point to that for sure of like, you do have to ask the question of how did this make its way into the oral tradition so that the story was available to people to be able to tell it, write it down. Yeah.
But also, God can quite literally speak to people, and yet, welcome to our sinfulness, we still get discouraged. I mean, look at, Jeremiah, who's literally hearing from God himself, and then he's still getting discouraged because, prophet without a convert type deal, right? That still happens. John could have literally been there, heard it along with everybody else, and then when you're sitting in prison, weeks away from getting your head lopped off, you might be a bit discouraged.
I think not only is that an excellent point, but even if you go further back than that, the Israelites in the wilderness did initially hear the audible voice of God. And it's one thing for them to say to Moses, as they did, we don't want to hear that guy anymore. Just go up onto that mountain and talk to him away from us and come back and tell us what he says. But they obviously also, having at least at the beginning heard the audible voice of God, were the same ones very shortly after that are like making idols, and God's calling them stiff-necked because they're just pretending that they don't have evidence that he's there, right? So it's, excellent point. So it is very possible that they did hear it and that John the Baptist could still get discouraged and come to a point of significant doubt. And like you said, it made its way clearly into the tradition. They all knew that this event took place. So, very good.
Yeah, going back to to what the centurion said, that truly this is the Son of God, talking about how Jesus is dying on the cross was like an execution. I started reading the crucifixion, and I think that book really gives us a very wonderful picture on how Jesus died.
Yeah, I agree. It's vivid. She paints a very vivid portrait of what happened, and like to a degree that it's kind of evocative. I think the way that she writes about it. Yeah.
There's a point where I was like, water was in my eye. I was like very, very emotional. Like,
I agree.
If that book could be acted out.
Figure out a way to perform it. I mean, it's already kind of taken on the status of a recent classic, so it wouldn't surprise me if somebody staged something with it at some point. But I agree. All right, very good. What we're going to do then is we're going to start by just reading these three passages, one after the other, and then we'll walk into the significance of a lot of them. We're going to read broader than the context of what's up here, just so that we kind of get the whole picture. So in Mark chapter 1, I'm actually going to begin, I'm just going to begin at the very beginning, and we'll just read all the way through the baptism scene. This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. As it is written in the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you who will prepare your way. The voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." So John the Baptizer appeared in the wilderness, proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And the whole Judean region and all the people of Jerusalem were going out to him and were baptized by him in the river Jordan, confessing their sins. Now John was clothed with camel's hair, with a leather belt around his waist, and he ate locusts and wild honey. He proclaimed, "The one who is more powerful than I is coming after me. I'm not worthy to stoop down and untie the strap of his sandals. I've baptized you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit." That, by the way, just as a sidebar, it's really interesting to read in Acts about the ongoing distinction between those two things. You see passages in Acts where it'll say, "Oh, well, so-and-so knew the baptism of John, but not the baptism of the Spirit." So they have to be sort of coached in the other. They know one, they have to be coached in the other. The distinction between these two pops up again in Acts. In the days that Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan, and just as he was coming out of the water, he saw the heavens torn apart, and the Spirit descending like a dove upon him. That doesn't mean only he saw, it's just pointing out that he's the one who did so. And a voice came from the heavens, "You are my Son, the Beloved, with you I am well pleased." So then if we flip over to chapter 9, I'm actually going to begin at 8:34. He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." He said to them, "Truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power." 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzlingly bright, such as no one on earth could brighten them. And there appeared to them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us set up 3 tents, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, right? That also sort of prefigures the cross itself. And from the cloud there came a voice, "This is my Son, the Beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Then they asked him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" He said to them, "Elijah is indeed coming, first to restore all things. How then is it written about the Son of Man that he is to go through many sufferings and be treated with contempt? But I tell you that Elijah has come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written about him." And then we will flip over to Mark 15. And we'll start in verse 33. When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, so this is the part we call the cry of dereliction. "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "Listen, he is calling for Elijah." And someone ran, filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a stick, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down." Then Jesus gave a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly this man was God's son." So, first of all, a few really quick notes about the Elijah thing. As I said, we're not going to get into sort of the theological significance of this, although it's an interesting puzzle. But if you go to Malachi, it says, "Remember the teaching of my servant Moses, the statutes and ordinances that I commanded him at Horeb for all Israel. See, I will send you the prophet Elijah before the great and terrible day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of parents to their children and hearts of children to their parents, so that I will not come and strike the land with a curse." So there was a prefiguration in the Hebrew scriptures that were already pointing to the coming of another Elijah-like figure. In 2 Kings 1:8, Elijah himself is described as a hairy man with a leather belt around his waist. Mark is sure to point out that John the Baptist was clothed with camel's hair. So not maybe that he was as hairy as Elijah, but that he looked that way. Also, and then he points out the leather belt around his waist. So why point out that John the Baptist is marching around with a leather belt? There's a sense in which for Mark it's like, oh, hey, I'm going to point out, in any way I can, I'm going to signal to you all that this is that Elijah type figure that was prefigured in the text. All right, so the cry. Here are some various interpretive possibilities for what is going on the cross when Jesus yells out, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani." And these are just the main ones that have been thrown around in scholarship. So I just want to give you a rough survey of this, and then we can kind of unpack what we think for ourselves. First, very popular view is that God the Father really and actually did abandon Jesus on the cross. So when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He yells this out because he's been abandoned. And the thinking here, for the most part, is that the abandonment would have something to do with Jesus taking upon himself the sins of the world, and God the Father then needing to surrender the Son over to that sin for the purpose of dying because of that sin, so that he could then conquer the death that the sin results in for the purpose of rising from the dead, right? So the abandonment would not be permanent, but it would still be real. A real abandonment, even if it's a temporary abandonment, to abandon Jesus over to death, to take upon the sins of the world. There are, I know a preacher who very much believed this, and every time he preached on this, usually like on Good Friday, Good Friday sermons for years, he did the same thing. He would get up on stage and he would preach about this, and then he would say, God in this moment has turned his back on the Son, and then this preacher I know would just turn his back to the crowd, right? Like to try to sort of evocatively symbolize what he thinks is going on here. So the idea in that strain of thinking is, again, very much that the Father and the Son, that there is a disconnect between them because the Son is now marred by the totality of the sins of the world. Another line of thinking says that Jesus was not actually abandoned by God on the cross, but that he only felt this way. We might initially think, well, does that mean Jesus could, as the Son of God, have a false feeling? Can he feel something that isn't real? Like he's not really abandoned, but he can feel. We're going to get into maybe how some people try to reconcile this and say, well, the feeling is not a false feeling, even if he's not really being abandoned. Both can be true, that he wasn't actually abandoned on the cross, but that the feeling is still a true feeling. Does that make sense? Like you can feel things where the feeling itself is still intended and should be felt, even if it's not in response to an exact articulation of the reality of what you're experiencing at the moment. And we have an example of this all over the Psalms. The psalmists very often feel things that we should validate, the feelings that are real and should be thought about and entered into, that are also still rooted in the perception of somebody. Now you might say, well, the psalmists weren't the Son of God and Jesus is, but there's still a sense where the example of the Psalms is, and what does Hebrews say? Jesus goes through the things we go through yet without sin. So just because Jesus felt very abandoned, if it's the fact that he wasn't really abandoned, it doesn't still mean that he's experiencing something false, because he's entering into something that is very much a human experience, right? So we'll kind of unpack that a little bit. The third possibility is that Jesus appealed to Psalm 22. Okay, so we're going to read that now here in a minute. My God, why have you forsaken me? He's quoting the very first line of Psalm 22. And a lot of people point out the fact that the psalm offers hope at the end, and the psalmist even seems, in saying, why have you forsaken me, the psalmist seems to know that he hasn't actually been forsaken. Right. So I'm going to read this to you and just kind of let it reflect on the words. And by the way, you'll notice as I read this psalm, it's not just the first line. Jesus only quotes the first line, but Mark evokes other parts of the psalm, which clearly seem to indicate that Mark, in his mind, has the whole psalm in view. But we still have to then ask ourselves, does Jesus have the whole psalm in mind when he quotes it? Does Jesus want to point us to the whole psalm? Or is he only expressing with the psalmist the experiences of the first line? Right? That's the question here. By invoking the first line, does he intend for us as the audience to then point to the whole rest of it? Like, would he have thought that the people that are there at the foot of the cross, I mean, first of all, does he even think about them in the moment? Maybe the cross is very much just an intimate moment between the Father and the Son, and Jesus isn't thinking about who's there watching him die at all. Or is it that he actually is screaming that line out because he assumes that and wants the people there at the cross that day to then go, oh, wait a minute, I know that psalm, and here's how it ends, right? So all of that has to factor into our thinking, but I'm going to read Psalm 22. It's 31 verses, so I'm just going to read through it and kind of listen for cues and little bits and pieces that might be relevant to the moment. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me, from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest. Yet you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. In our ancestors trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. But I am a worm and not human, scorned by others and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They sneer at me, they shake their heads. Commit your cause to the Lord. Let him deliver. Let him rescue the one in whom he delights. Yet it was you who took me from the womb. You kept me safe on my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth. And since my mother bore me, you have been my God. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help. Many bulls encircle me, strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water, and all of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd. My tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of the earth. For dogs are all around me. A company of evildoers encircles me. They bound my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. They stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among themselves, and for my clothing they cast lots. But you, O Lord, do not be far away. O my help, come quickly to my aid. Deliver my soul from the sword, my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion. From the horns of the wild oxen you have rescued me. I will tell of your name to my brothers and sisters in the midst of the congregation. I will praise you. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All you offspring of Jacob, glorify him. Stand in awe of him, all you offspring of Israel. For he did not despise or abhor the affliction of the afflicted. He did not hide his face from me. That's the important piece there, right? He did not hide his face from me, but heard when I cried to him. For you comes my praise in the great congregation. My vows I will pay before those who fear him. The poor shall eat and be satisfied. Those who seek him shall praise the Lord. May your hearts live forever. All the ends of the earth shall remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations shall worship before him. For dominion belongs to the Lord, and he rules over the nations. To him indeed shall all who sleep in the earth bow down. Before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, and I shall live for him. Posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord and proclaim his deliverance to a people yet unborn, saying that he has done it. So first, just observations. What do you hear in that psalm that you can probably relate to some degree with what's going on the cross?
there's verse 8, trust in the Lord, let the Lord rescue him. Isn't that something the crowds said? Not Jesus.
Right. Yeah, that's part of the mocking, right? Like, oh, if you're the Son of God, why don't you just call on help? Yeah, very good.
Not looking at the cross, but looking at verse 8, it says that they divide my clothes among them and cast lots.
Yeah. Yeah, which happens during the trial and right before he's crucified. Yep, very good. And Mark points that out. So Mark is drawing on that exact verse. So even though Jesus only quotes the one line, Mark is clearly thinking about other parts of the psalm. When he's like, oh yeah, that happened to Jesus actually. That's in the psalm and that actually happened. So let me point to, and yeah, he's trying to make that connection. Very good.
Verse 15 that says, "My tongue sticks to my jaws." I think that means like he's thirsty and stuff, and Jesus says he's thirsty on the cross.
Yeah, very good. Very good.
Verse 14, it's poured out like water, all of his bones are out of joint and such, and how they pierced him afterward. All the blood and water came out.
Yeah, which is interesting too, right? Because it makes a point at the cross that his bones were not actually shattered or broken. So out of joint is and the water pouring out and all of that. It's like very particular about nuancing the details of how all that happened. Yeah.
Verse 6 through 8. I am a worm, not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by people. All who see me mock me, they make mouths at me, they wag their heads. That's all stuff that was going on with the crowds.
Yeah.
And then verse 8 is almost quoted as, almost a direct quote of how they were mocking him. He trusts in the Lord, let him deliver him, let him rescue him, for he delights in him.
Yeah,
Like it's almost said sarcastically on the crowds from the cross.
Yeah, and isn't that interesting that the sort of irony of that? Like that the psalmist is writing these things, and then the crowds around Jesus are very unwittingly and very ironically sort of bringing all of this to bear. Yeah, very good.
I think at the end of verse 11, there's no one to help. That kind of abandonment piece of his disciples and the people that he trusted the most on the earth kind of left him for dead.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the texts are a bit unclear as to who's there and who isn't at the crucifixion itself. But certainly after the fact, they all sort of duck and hide. And they're like sitting around in a room somewhere, like, what do we do now? Right, exactly. Yeah, very much. And by the way, we're going to get into that because Mark seems to really hint at that broader abandonment, not just of between the father and son potentially, but the broader abandonment of the people around him as well. I think Mark really hits on that. So, yeah, excellent.
16 to 18 all seems to cross the company of evildoers encircling me, they have pierced my hands. Verse 17 seems to point to the excruciating pain and suffering I can count on as they stare.
Yeah. Yeah, the binding of the hands and feet is quite similar to the piercing of the hands and feet. Yeah. So you can see a lot of these connections that are there, right? Whether they're thematic, some of them are directly linguistic, some of them are clearly the cross scene is drawing on some of this. So that has led to this, what is still really an ongoing debate, actually, by scholars who are really into intertextuality, of is quoting the first line of a psalm enough to invoke the whole thing. Some have pointed out that there's actually a practice of that very thing being the case. That you would, and by the way, we still do this today in poetry. I'm a big poetry reader, and sometimes poets, most of the time, they'll name every poem, like there'll be a title for the poem. But sometimes there are some poets who don't actually provide titles for their poems, and then you have to go to the back in an index, and it'll just be the first line of each poem then it serves as the title for the whole. And so there is some discussion about the fact that even then in the ancient world that's how they would have indicated psalms. That we didn't number the psalms until quite a bit later, of course, that they would have indicated them by just saying the first line. The first line then tells you that's the psalm you're thinking of, and then everybody would have just known that whole psalm. And you can even imagine some of the psalms of ascent are the psalms they would sing on their march up to Jerusalem, right? So they would be walking up that hill, and then somebody might even just say the first line of the next one that they want to sing, and then there's, oh, we know that one, and then they'll sing the whole based on somebody indicating a first line or something like that.
Sorry, follow-up question. When I mentioned this, you just mentioned that piercing of the hands and similar.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean, are you implying that he wasn't pierced?
No, I'm saying in the psalm it says bound.
Versus bound?
If yours says pierced, I would, yeah.
The NIV
ESV
says
says
pierced.
Does it really?
ESV says pierced too.
Okay, I'm gonna have to put some thought then, and I'll go back and look at the Hebrew more carefully, because in the psalm itself, I think it's that word suggests more of a binding than a piercing. So it makes me wonder if I'm not. I don't want to say this with any certainty until I can have a chance to look at it. It makes me wonder if there's an interpretive translation going on there, because I think in the Hebrew and the psalm, it's actually the word there. It seems to, on my recollection, it implies more of a binding than a piercing. Yeah, I'm glad you point that out. I'll go look at it later. All right, so all of these things come into play, though, right, on Jesus quoting this line. To what degree, if at all, does he mean to invoke the entirety of the psalm, including its portions of hope? Including, by the way, there's the one part that we read where it's that the psalmist feels forsaken, and even the psalmist himself by the end of the psalm gets around to, oh, but you have not ever actually turned your eyes away from it. So that preacher that I told you that I know that would sort of show what he thinks is going on by turning his whole back. God's turning away from the sun. In the psalm, the psalmist is saying, I know you're not actually doing that at all, that you wouldn't. So again, the degree to which Jesus is experiencing what the psalmist is experiencing is an important question we have to ask ourselves. All right, a fourth possibility, that Jesus used the psalm to ask God to intervene, right? So what is the psalm doing? It says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then the psalmist asks God to intervene before he then affirms that he thinks God will intervene or that God does intervene. He asks him to first. There is a request in the psalm itself. So some would say that Jesus, right, what did Jesus say in the Garden of Gethsemane? If there's any way else for us to do this, I would really like to do this differently. But if not my will be done, but your will be done. So some would say that on the cross, there's still this sense of like Jesus is going through something quite a bit more theologically, spiritually profound than even just the act of physical death. And that the my God, why have you forsaken me, is to invoke the request. Sorry, I know it looks like maybe you guys are trying to look it up. Maybe we should table that and go back to it after class or another time. It looks like there's possibly a request being made by Jesus for God to intervene. And so, yeah, that's one of the ideas that's out there as well about this. That the psalmists are across the Psalms asking God often to intervene, and maybe Jesus is doing the same. That maybe Jesus cries out, not because he is being forsaken by God, or even because he himself feels forsaken by God. And we'll get to the idea that, like, in Mark, there's lots of indicators that Jesus knew what was going on here, right? Like, he was a part of the plan. Like, there's the Father does not do what the Son does, and the Son does not do what the Father does, but they're not separate. Like, we're talking about one God here, right? So this idea that Jesus was in on the whole thing, like this is a Trinitarian plan in the works. So that theologically we could say, well, if they're all in on this, then why else would he cry this out? Some say that it's because he's crying it out to identify with the forsaken, rather than because he himself feels forsaken. And you get this sense too, right, that there's this identification between the suffering of Jesus and the suffering of the sufferers. Paul says, for example, you are only co-heirs with Christ, provided that you suffer with him. But it's also not just that you suffer with him, but that he suffers with and for you. That Jesus is the God who enters into the suffering of his people. And by entering into our suffering, that the cry of my God, why have you forsaken me, is an indicator that he has done this, that he has entered into the suffering of the forsaken. So he's doing this to identify with those who either feel forsaken or genuinely have been by society in some meaningful sense. Right? And then finally, there are some scholars who have argued for various combinations of all of these. Some would say, well, there's lots of things probably going on here. All right. So the forsaken appears in the Psalms regularly, not just in the one we just read yet.
Sorry, I just have a quick question about that first one. The view that God the Father actually abandoned Jesus on the cross. And maybe this question is a little too pointed, but people who argue for this view, is there any sense in which they address the idea that this might be a Trinitarian heresy that undermines the hypostatic union?
sort of, and we're going to get to that. It's an excellent question. I have a slide for that, just a few slides from now, where I'm literally going to say, from our Trinitarian perspective, does this create any problems and consternation, and do we need to think that through more carefully? So I like that you're asking that. We're absolutely going to ask that question in a moment. But now that he's done so, be aware that in a couple of slides we're going to get there, and I want to ask you all what you think about that, because it's an excellent question. All right, so when forsaken appears in the Psalms, generally it does tend to refer to somebody who has been cast off, rejected, turned from in anger, forgotten about, or literally it can refer to one hiding one's face from another. So this idea that forsaken could mean that God is hiding his face from Jesus on the cross. The meaning of the usage of the word in the Psalms indicates that is within its range of meaning. It doesn't mean that that's what's going on here, but we just have to be aware that that's within the range of meaning as we try to decide for ourselves what we think is happening. All right, so was Jesus actually abandoned by the Father? Those who hold to the penal substitutionary atonement theory often hold this view, but I want to say this. One, I think it'd be hard to hold this view and not believe in penal substitutionary atonement, but you can believe in penal substitutionary atonement and not hold this view. Does that make sense? I know lots of people who believe that penal substitutionary atonement is the right way to look at the atonement, but who do not agree that this is how that is manifesting itself. Just because Jesus is taking on our punishment on our behalf, which is penal substitutionary atonement, doesn't mean that God is forsaking the Son on the cross in the act of that happening. Does that make sense? So you can hold the penal substitutionary atonement and not believe that Jesus has been abandoned by the Father. In the narrative, Jesus endures considerable abuse by the Roman soldiers. He's mocked by both Romans and Jewish leaders, and even those who crucified with him, that's in Luke, mock him, right? So there is a sense in which the whole picture of the crucifixion that we get from the Gospels is that he, and especially in Mark, I think, is that he's not only that there's a potential of abandonment here between Father and Son, but the theme of abandonment is at least illustrated in other places, and that some would bring that into the consideration, right? For example, in Mark itself, if Mark has this theme of wanting to demonstrate to us an overall motif of abandonment, then we can more safely assume that the relationship between the Father and Son also is an indication of that abandonment. That's what some would argue. The narrative sets up the abandonment of Jesus by demonstrating his isolation. He's been rejected by Judas, abandoned by the disciples, and there's even that one spot in the story where that random little naked guy in the naked cloth. You guys know that story? You know, there's a theory that the little guy in the naked cloth is Mark, right? I mean, there's absolutely no way we could know that. But I think people just come up with that because it's such a random story. It's only in Mark, and why in the world would you put that in? It is such an awkward addition to the story. The crowds who were once amazed by his teaching, some of them are now the ones yelling, "Crucify him," right? So it's like from every single angle, from his own disciples, from Judas, who's one of his followers and best friends, to some random kid in a linen cloth, to the crowd themselves, virtually everybody in the text, aside from his mom and what is probably his aunt. We talked about that in Women in the New Testament last semester, but maybe his aunt. And a couple of other people are standing around at the cross, potentially. But I mean, for the most part, they're all gone. Now, this is interesting because C.S. Lewis talks about, now we're going to get into that Trinitarian. I think this is an important question. C.S. Lewis talks about the Trinity this way, and there are problems with his analogy, and lots of people have pointed out problems with his analogy, but we're going to just kind of, for the purpose of trying to at least inaugurate this discussion. C.S. Lewis said, "The Father delights in the Son looks up to his Father. What the Christians mean by the statement, God is love, is that the living, dynamic activity of love has been going on in God forever and has created everything else. In Christianity, God is not a static thing, but a dynamic, pulsating activity, a life, almost a kind of drama. So his point here is that what it means for God to be love is that love has existed in eternity past long before anything else did. The love between the Father and Son has always been there and is an unbreakable bond, right? But then he says, it's a kind of drama, almost, if you will not think me irreverent, a kind of dance. So it's a very famous metaphor that Lewis used, that the Father, Son, and the Spirit are sort of in a dance with one another.
This is where we get the idea of perichoresis, or was that before this? He's just writing in a similar way.
Yeah,
Yes, the second one, probably. That's Lewis summary.
yeah, right. Yeah, so, yeah, and I don't think Lewis is trying to probably necessarily invoke a more complicated theological thinking in this. I think he's just trying to very simply think about the relationship between the Father, Son, Spirit as this ongoing relationship of mutuality, love, that sort of thing. Now, but here's what's interesting. Borrowing this language, then, Tim Keller, who believed very much in this first option, that Jesus was abandoned by the Father, wrote it this way. With the cry of dereliction, Jesus has been cut off from the dance. So Keller, with this view, borrowing Lewis's metaphor, says that in his opinion, that Jesus has been actually factually cut off in some way from the Father and the Spirit, cut off from the dance as a whole. So I'm bringing this in because I think Sean's question is a very important one, right? We do have to ask that Trinitarian question. Well, I'm going to give a couple more quick quotes for you, and then we'll get to that. Walter Brueggemann appeals to the purpose of lament psalms to try to solve this problem. In his view, lament psalms have three components. And if you don't know who Brueggemann is, he's legendary Hebrew Bible scholar and did a lot of work on the Psalms. He wrote several books on them. And for Psalms of Lament, he really finds these three basic things going on. And so this is important. Why, right? Because Psalm 22 is a psalm of lament. So Jesus is quoting this kind of psalm. And Brueggemann says that those kinds of psalms do these three things. They have a description of suffering in which God's abandonment is assumed. But the lamentists, in every case, assumed that to some meaningful degree they have been abandoned. Number two, they petition God for his help and expect that he will because of his character. God's character is the kind of character that will come to their aid. And then three, that there is then a motivation provided for action in which the speaker then reminds God of his goodness. Like, God, you have done X, Y, Z, therefore I know that, right? You will have my back and come to my aid. So then Brueggemann's thing is at the cross, then Jesus expects the Father to intervene, but that the abandonment must be real. That Jesus is lamenting on the cross in the way in which the psalmist would lament. Therefore, the abandonment is, in some very meaningful sense, a reality at the moment. Helen Bond, one of my old professors, she says, and let me say it this way, Helen Bond is a historian through and through. Like, denies the resurrection, like is not a Christian, quote-unquote Christian scholar in the way that a lot of these other scholars are, but she's an expert on the literature of the New Testament. And so she's looking at Mark simply from a literary perspective, and she's not thinking, based on my understanding, I've had coffee with her many times, and I had her as a professor in a couple classes. My understanding of her is that she's not thinking about this through a theological lens, but strictly through the literature of Mark. And she's published on the Gospel of Mark in particular several times. And so she knows the text itself as a literary piece. And based on that, this is what she says. In the end, it's better to take Mark's text at face value here. His Jesus dies in utter desolation, abandoned not only by his erstwhile followers, but apparently by God himself. So her take is that the text of Mark itself seems to suggest we're supposed to read it this way, as a real abandonment. So, boom, let's get to Sean's question. How then, if at all, does our Trinitarian theology affect our views? So I say, if at all. We have to ask, should it affect the way we read this? And if so, how? How would it affect our views regarding this Father-Son dynamic on the cross? Is it even appropriate to interject the development of Trinitarian theology into this moment? Like Mark may or may not have been thinking about that. Jesus would have, because he knows he's a person of a Trinitarian God, right? But if we can interject that, the theological thinking, the theology of this into the discussion, then does that have any weight or bearing on how we think about the potential for abandonment?
So are you making a distinction between like the development of Mark's understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity?
I'm not trying to make any distinction. I'm just asking a very broad question of, does our Trinitarian theology, should it affect the way we read the story, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think it's St. Thomas Aquinas talks about how like this comes down to Jesus' two natures, and how in his lower reason of his human nature he felt the full separation, but he couldn't have in his divine nature been like severed from the Father, because that, like, we believe in the Trinity, and if the Trinity is the Trinity, then it can't change because God is immutable, and a real Trinitarian rupture would make God not God, basically.
So that's super helpful, not only because that helps us to sort of think through the dynamic of abandonment, but the dynamic of death. People ask the question about that, right? Because, so like Moltmann's very famous title of his book, The Crucified God, where I hear preachers all the time say that God died. But in that same line of thinking, the human Jesus died, but can God die? Like Colossians 1 says that Jesus is holding all things together by the word of his power. And so is it possible for the one who has to literally sustain all things to then have even a momentary true death? Like, can God actually die? Or, even though we should always resist as much as possible separating the human from the divine in Jesus, is there still some sense in which we have no choice but to say, the human Jesus felt abandoned, the divine Jesus couldn't have been. The human Jesus died on the cross, but the divine God cannot die. It's a struggle to decide where or how can we or must we think about a distinction there versus resisting the temptation of trying to pull apart the natures of Jesus, which we know we really shouldn't do. I think that's super helpful, at least to introduce that piece into the conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, part of the question then is like, does our Christology affect our views of this dynamic? Because we don't, on one hand we don't want to be Nestorian where we separate them too much. But when you said about how pastors will say that God died, like I can't remember I could try to find it in Acts where it's like God bought the church by his blood. Like, so if we're speaking, this is like nuanced theological stuff where we can ascribe to the person Jesus both divine and human attributes, but not to the nature. So yeah, it becomes pretty nuanced.
I like that you use the word nuance. It's very nuanced. Yeah. Sam.
Just to bounce off of Brandon's point there, in Ursinius's commentary on the Heidelberg Catechism, that's one of the objections that he actually answers. He says, "But it is said that God purchased the church with his own blood, and hence the deity must have suffered." That's an objection. Answer: this does not follow because the form of speech is changed. When it is said that God died, this is spoken figuratively by a synecdoche, or by the communication of properties, as we've already explained, like in text like before this, he's referring to. But when it is said that the deity suffered, this is spoken without a figure, because the subject is taken the abstract. Again, no consequence from the concrete to the abstract of any force. The concrete, which is God, signifies the subject having a form. The abstract, which is deity, signifies the naked form or the nature only. This doctrine, therefore, the concrete is the name of the person, and the abstract is the name of the nature. So in other words, what he's saying is that when you say that God died, versus when he uses the deity, right? When you're saying that the divine nature died, you're talking about the subject, and you're saying that, like, as in like God, the actual, God, versus when you say Jesus died, you're talking about his nature, like one of his natures. So I don't know. It's kind of complex, but it's also Old English. So, but yeah, Ursinius's commentary to Heidelberg Catechism for sure. Might want to translate that into modern English with ChatGPT. So
I think kind of going back to what you were saying about not being Nestorian. I mean, that whole controversy was about whether Mary can properly be called
Right.
the mother of God or just the mother of Jesus.
Yeah.
And if Mary is properly the mother of God, then it almost seems like we have to also be able to, in some real sense, say that God died.
Yeah, that's a good connection historically.
Nuanced. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the difficulty with. So when I said how, if at all, does our Trinitarian theology affect this? There are some scholars like Richard Bachman, who is a believing scholar and has written very meaningfully about the nature of God in some places. But when he does biblical studies scholarship on this passage, his insistence is that trying to import Trinitarian thinking in any kind of fashion into this text is just not possible. Because the passage doesn't give us enough to be able to nuance all of this discussion well enough. I'm not saying you have to agree with him. I'm just saying, and we're going to quote from him several times, if not today, but on next class on Tuesday, where he tries to sort of break down and think through this passage. But for him, for Bachman, it is really difficult because this whole discussion needs to be so nuanced. It's difficult to import it into what's going on in Mark's discussion of the story of what's going on here. Yeah.
yeah, and I'm not going to quote some old English. I'll be modern English. I think yes, our Trinitarian theology affects our views because it keeps us from, saying that, like, I've literally heard as an interpretive option that the Trinity was broken on the cross, which is like insane.
Oh yeah.
So there is an extent to which that is like we need to maintain our understanding of the Trinity lest we fall into those errors.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we almost have to focus more so on our understanding of the hypostatic union, to understand that Christ was abandoned in his human nature, but because of our understanding of the Trinity and how that operates, that he couldn't have been in his divinity. Like,
I think that's an important
understanding that
distinction
one
that I
person-
probably need to bake into this slide in the future. That it's not just do we have to talk about the nuances of the Trinity, but also of the nature of the two natures
Yeah.
of Christ himself.
They're both
Yeah, I
separately
think that's an
linked.
important distinction because those are absolutely related, but not exactly the same conversation. I think that's helpful.
Because
yeah.
also, if like God's impassible, then he can't suffer. So we can't rightly say that Christ in his divinity even suffered on the cross, let alone felt like was
Yeah.
abandoned.
And yet it's also still appropriate to say that Jesus as God entered into our suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, like
In
there
his
is a
human
distinction
nature.
even there to be made, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, I think your hand was up and then I'll go here. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just thinking too of like with Sam saying, the Trinity's broken and stuff, that assumes parts, which we know is not true. And then there's also the doctrine of, it's called like the extra Calvinisticum, where the divine Son isn't circumscribed by his flesh. It's not as if he utterly was separated from the Trinity even in the incarnation,
Right.
but that he, even in his taking on a human nature, still exists with complete unity in the Trinity in heaven. And so yeah, so that's too a complication where he's still somehow in heaven as the divine Son, still ruling and reigning with the Father and the Spirit, and also has taken on a human nature in addition to his divine nature.
Saki left heaven,
Yeah.
but he
Also-
kind of did.
But
no.
Which is also then, of course, that's the whole Philippians 2 conversation. It's
Right.
also very complicated. So
I was thinking that maybe we should go beyond that to understand the whole scenario.
yeah,
So we have God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Now the Son became flesh and was named Jesus Christ. And then on the cross, he died as a human.
yeah,
He took the form of man and died. But still on that, he tells the other person on the right or left side that today you be with me in paradise. Which means, I think his body, he was dead like as a man. But of course, because he cannot really die,
Yeah.
he's telling the other guy, hey, today you be with me in paradise.
Yeah.
So did he really die?
yeah. So I think that's important too because we also very much, of course, have the idea too that like we think about it this way, when the body of Jesus was in the tomb, was Jesus still present, meaningfully present somewhere doing something? And our answer is yes, right? So, like, he was meaningfully present doing things while his dead body was not moving, was lifeless in a tomb. So, yeah, it's still important to sort of think through, yeah.
I'm also thinking in line of Brookman that Jesus' nature of being human, he suffers and he feels that pain, and that's how he thinks of God abandoning him. But I'm also thinking in the concept of death. How does death in the Old Testament and New Testament talks about God? Because when we are discussing and saying is God died, what does that mean? Does that mean the breath got out, or what's death? The concept of God. Because when we die as Christians, it does not mean that we lose the breath course, but we still exist because we live in Christ. So when I look at that, I don't think that God is dying literally, that the breath is gone, so he doesn't exist. But the concept is kind of nuances and complex, but death exists, but how do we understand death?
Yeah, that's interesting too, right? Because, I mean, unless you believe in some form of like soul sleep, then even at our own death, I mean, the Bible's very clear that we are, as a human, an entire unity. Sort of the dualistic separation of body from soul, at least the way it's often characterized, is not quite right biblically. And yet, when our bodies die, we don't cease to exist until the resurrection, probably, right? So, yeah, those are important questions too. Very good.
I think he had.
Okay, we'll go Sean, and then we'll go. Yeah.
He's had his hand up way longer.
Okay. Go here first. I didn't know who was first.
All these views that my peers mentioned, I think, affects the unity of God. But then the question is, if he's mutable, not feeling the suffering, if he's not abandoned, if he doesn't die, how is punishment satisfied? How is justice satisfied?
Right. It's a good question, which I think I'll punt only because I think we're going to try to some degree to answer a little bit of that in a few weeks. But I think part of the answer anyway, I think your question's a good one because it's also quite large and needs a lot of nuance. Part of the question of how is he taking all of this on? There is a sense in the Levitical sacrifices that the animal that dies for the sake of the sins of those that the animal is being sacrificed on behalf of, that the animal is carrying the sins or taking on the sins, but not being punished. Like nobody looked at the animal and thought, I'm going to punish this sacrifice for my sins. But that the animal still had to meaningfully pass through death for the sins to be reconciled and atoned for. So there is a distinction that needs to be discussed about the difference between Jesus diverting the wrath of God against our sins so that we no longer have to be punished versus Jesus being actively punished. And I think it's really, we'll get to a point later in the semester where we're also going to have just as nuanced a conversation about that.
You're saying that he's passing through death but not dying.
No, passing through death by dying, yeah. So you die, but the death itself is not that you're diverting punishment and diverting the wrath of God without being actively punished. So yes, he dies, but he dies for the purpose of passing through death, in the same way that the Levitical sacrifice had to pass through death. Now, what does it mean for the Levitical sacrifice to pass through death? We'll get into that, but it passed through death so that what happened to that sacrifice after the death became just as, if not more meaningful, than the death itself. When the animal died, what did they do? They weren't done. They took that blood of that animal into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled it on the altar. They took the carcass to the burning table and burned it in the burnt offering. And it said that the aroma of the burnt offering, when it reached God, was a pleasing aroma that he found satisfying, that his wrath was satisfied by the aroma of the burning carcass, not through an active punishment of the animal itself. So the Levitical sacrifices are, according to the writer of Hebrews, is prefiguring how we should think about all the little elements and pieces of what Jesus goes through. So the degree to which we think about Jesus being, quote unquote, actively punished versus just taking away our punishment is, I'm not suggesting one or the other. I'm saying we're going to have a conversation in a few weeks about how the Bible seems to think that through. And I think there's things in the Bible that could point you either direction, which is why it's a debate, right? So I think that's a great question, but we'll point more to it for sure as we kind of get there later. I think Sean and then over here, yeah.
Yeah, so I don't want to be too redundant because we've been talking about this back and forth for a little bit. But I swing the pendulum too far sometimes. And so like the view that Jesus was completely abandoned by the Father, to me I just see that as blatant heresy. And I don't think that scholars like Tim Keller are ignorant of the first four councils. And so I'm curious, in what ways do the advocates of this view actually like deal with the hypostatic union? How do they explicitly deal with the Trinitarian theology?
Well, that's too big of a question for today, only in the sense that all of them probably do so differently. I'm not sure that there's like a monolithic way in which that's the case. I mean, there are going to be some, like Helen Bond, who I quoted, who wouldn't deal with it at all, because she's just looking at Mark as a piece of literature and saying, what does Mark seem to say within the context of his own narrative? And what is he dealing with as opposed to how we should think about it more broadly? Richard Bauckham, who is a very passionate Christian man, would, I'm sure, have things to say about this, but his answer is we shouldn't import that into this discussion. We should only just look for what we think the narrative itself is suggesting. But my response to that, and I'm a huge Bauckham guy, he's one of my favorite scholars, my response to that would be, though, it seems to me irresponsible not to talk about this question, which is why I'm asking about it, even if I'm not trying to provide answers, right? Because and we still believe very much that God is a Trinitarian God, and how could we not? But so I guess I'm saying all that to just say I think every individual, first of all, I would say, I'm not telling you what to think, my advice would be to be deeply hesitant to ever use the heresy word at all, unless it's like an overwhelmingly clear, like there certainly is a such thing as heresy, right? But I think we throw it around way too much. And I would certainly say that on this, virtually everybody I know that holds to this, I wouldn't call a single one of them a heretic. So I would caution everybody a little bit on throwing that word around too easily or too lightly. Heresy is a very serious charge. It's not to be, I don't think it's to be considered lightly at all. And I wouldn't call any of these people heretics myself. But I would agree that we should talk about it. But the way in which everybody would nuance it is going to be a little bit different for each person, I think, that holds this view. Yeah, I mean, like I said, that I have that friend who's a pastor who preached that a lot. I went to a lot of his Good Friday services over the years where he always preached that idea that Jesus was being abandoned on the cross. But yeah, I mean, maybe one day, the next time I get a chance, I'll have to ask him how he would deal with the Trinitarian implications of this, because I'd never really heard him in those sermons unpack that at all. So I'm sure it's going to be different for everybody.
Yeah, I'm just wondering.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I maybe not to divert too much, but I heard I had a professor challenge this idea with kind of questioning like God's omnipresence as well. Like, can God not be present with the Son? And then in my mind, going to like Abraham and Isaac too in the situation of like, could there be elements of that with Jesus's cry here too of like appealing to being rescued in that sense as well, or is that not relevant at all?
So, yeah, both great possibilities. The Isaac thing is interesting because, and we're going to get to this later in later weeks as well. So I'm always trying to be like, how much of this can I punt for a later discussion? Romans 8:31-39. Paul seems to probably be alluding to that story. And he says that God the Father did not stop short of offering his Son for us. Right? So he seems to be alluding to the idea of the Isaac thing where Abraham was willing but didn't have to. God was also willing but did have to, and he followed through. So there's the degree to which, at the very least, because we're going to talk about this. This is, by the way, to me, the ways in which Leviticus connects with the cross. And not just the cross, the resurrection, the ascension. There's an argument that the smoke from the burnt offering prefigures the ascension of Jesus. We're going to kind of get into some of that. So the Jesus is actually pointing to all sorts of little pieces of the Levitical sacrifices. But one of the hardest puzzles about how that might fit together is who is the supplicant? Meaning who's supplying the sacrifice? Because depending on what part of the New Testament you look at, actually I think the answer is different. Sometimes Jesus seems like he's offering himself as the supplicant. Sometimes it's the Father offering the Son. The Father offers him as the supplicant. Sometimes we're supposed to be the supplicant because Jesus is dying on our behalf, like the sacrifice would die on behalf of the person who's in the sin. So depending on where you look, that you might have to answer that somewhat differently. Maybe it's kind of all of the above. But in Romans in particular, the Father is supplying like Abraham did, but then follows through. The omnipresent question, I think, is difficult in the sense that even though it's true that God is omnipresent, we cannot say that he is equally present in the same way in all places. So like when God in Ezekiel 10 very clearly leaves the temple and abandons it, God is omnipresent. He's still there in a sense, but there's also a sense in which a particular form or type of presence of God very clearly leaves, like he abandons Israel in that moment. So if he can do that, can he then also abandon the Son on the cross, even if he is technically present because he has to be? Right? There's a special presence of God that's not the same in every place. So if we have, we'll go here because I think your hand was up next, and if we have time, we'll come back over here. We're almost, yeah.
I think it's a quick question. Like with your point, how you said some would just say we can't import like Trinitarian theology and stuff that's been developed throughout history onto this text. The question was like, how do we even avoid that?
Yeah.
Like, because yeah, I'm just thinking like this is who Jesus is, right? Like this is to a degree how Mark is presenting him anyway, that he's the God man throughout his narrative. So how do we even avoid that?
Yeah, I think we'll get to that more on Tuesday. I think Baucham's thing is not necessarily that we avoid it in total, but that we avoid it. Baucham is very concerned in his exegetical work, even though he also has theological work. In his exegetical work, his concern is that the best exegesis is always looking at the internal logic of a text in light of what the text is saying, rather than importing anything that it's not saying. And that too many of the nuances we're talking about now for him would be importing those into a text whose logic doesn't necessarily point us in those directions. We're only going in those directions because we have 2,000 years of theological reflection that we can then say, let's bring all this to bear and then have to nuance all this. But like if we were having this conversation right now, would Mark have been like, I didn't have any of that input, right? So I think his hesitancy is just, I want to let Mark speak for Mark, and if I have to do a separate theological conversation, that's fine. But he wants to first start with what does Mark mean?
Yeah.
Right.
That makes
So
sense.
that's for him. That's the distinction. Yeah. We have just enough time. Yeah.
And it's just like brief comments on the omnipresence thing.
Yeah.
Is that, I mean, because God is omnipresent, there is not a place where God is not, right?
Yeah.
That even applies to like places like hell. But we also know that God is, he's present in hell, but only in his like righteous wrath and justice.
Yeah,
so
right.
in the same way, like even though if Jesus was abandoned, like by God, that means God could be there 100% in his wrath and justice, pouring on all that due punishment on Jesus that was for us.
Yeah.
And yet that blessedness, that communion that Jesus had all of his life up until that point, being especially part of the Trinity that way and having that special connection, that's cut off. And then he goes from like a connection that none of us could imagine to like taking the totality of punishment.
Yeah.
And God's wrath on the cross.
Yeah, so like the fact
God
of
doesn't
presence
cease to be present.
Like the fact of presence versus the how. Like God is always present, but present differently.
Yeah.
Right. I think is an important thing to think through. Yeah, very good. All right, I wish we had more time to keep batting this around, but we are not done with this discussion. So we'll keep rolling with it on Tuesday. Let me pray for you all. Father, thank you so much for this time, for the very deliberate and helpful way that we're able in this class to hopefully dialogue about these things and process them together. Such an important conversation, obviously, because your willingness to send your son and his willingness to come and to go through these things. It's important for us to discuss them because we cannot take them for granted. And so ultimately we want to say, even as we dialogue about these things, that all of us hopefully have a very strong posture of gratitude to you for the things that we're talking about, for the results of what Jesus accomplished on our behalf. We're grateful for it. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right. See you then.
Thank you.